Hello, friends, and welcome to another episode of Chai Talk with Wajhatali for the Left Hook Substack, where I talk to individuals who are far smarter than me, and we break down one major question in 30 minutes or less. And today, I have the esteemed Professor Omer Bartov. He is one of the scholars on Holocaust and genocide. He's a professor at Brown University on Holocaust studies, and furthermore, he has a fantastic book coming out. I can't wait to read it, called Israel: What Went Wrong. It's coming out in April. And Professor Bartov, just recently, a couple of weeks ago, wrote a really fascinating and I think extremely important essay in the New York Times where he described Israel's actions in Gaza as a genocide. We'll talk about why that was so important and why specifically when Omer Bartov says that the world pays attention. But I actually am very curious about the question, Israel, what went wrong? And where it's going. And before I do that, though, Professor Bartov, I do want to ask this question because we're recording this. Every day there's a new fresh wave of horror stories. But I'm about to go talk to an organization. And in that organization in New York, there are certain individuals who are Jewish American who are feeling, if you will, uh, anger, sadness, dismay, shock that their colleagues would criticize Israel. And they're shocked that people are using the word genocide. And they're shocked that people are saying that Israel is committing war crimes. And they're saying, okay, well, yes, Netanyahu's terrible. And yes, what Israel's doing in Gaza, we've seen for the past 22 months is wrong. But the word genocide, you can't use that word genocide. It's too triggering. And words matter. And so the question I want to ask you is, why is it important at this moment in history to use the word genocide to describe what Israel's doing? And what would you say to those individuals who say, let's not go that far?
Okay, so first of all, thanks for having me. It's nice to meet you, virtually at least. Why use the word genocide? Genocide is a term that was coined by a Jewish-Polish lawyer called Raphael Lemkin, who already was looking for some term to describe a particular crime that he originally identified as having been carried out against the Armenians by the Ottoman Empire in World War I, the attempt to destroy a group as such. And this was in the mid 1930s. Then Poland was invaded by Germany. He was Jewish. He had to flee. Most of his family was murdered by the Nazis, and he ended up in the United States. And in 1944, he published a book in which he defined the term genocide. He coined the word, which is a combination of Latin and Greek, meaning the destruction of a group, killing of a group. And he then campaigned for that term to become part of the new UN, of international legislation by the UN that was founded in 1945. And in 1948, the UN passed a convention on genocide, adopted a convention on genocide, which came into force in 1951 when a sufficient number of countries voted in favor. And it is now has been signed by most of the countries in the world. So why is it important? First of all, if you as a state recognize that a genocide is happening and you're a signatory of the Genocide Convention, and that is Israel is a signatory, the United States is a signatory, all European states are signatories, then that has particular obligations.
Mm.
That means in the first paragraph of the Genocide Convention, it says that such states that are signatories need to do something about it. And officially, it is called a Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. So you have to prevent it, you have to stop it when it's happening, and you have to punish those who carried it out if you indeed identify that crime as taking place. So there is an obligation attached to it. That's one very important element of saying about some event that it is genocide. And that's different from saying it's a war crime or a crime against humanity because of this convention. Secondly, that convention defines quite clearly what a genocide is. Now, it doesn't say that a genocide has to look like the Holocaust.
Mm.
It is true that the Holocaust was a trigger and other crimes by the Nazis, but certainly the Holocaust, a trigger for the UN, for the United Nations, to come to an agreement to have a particular convention about this crime. But the way it is defined is as follows: that genocide is acts carried out with the intent to destroy a particular group, an ethnic or a national or religious or racial group, in whole or in part as such. And then it gives several examples of what these actions would be. And so what it talks about is actions that are carried out with the intent of destroying a group. So if you kill people, or if you make life impossible for people, or if you prevent births in a particular group, you're doing that with the goal of that group disappearing, not necessarily all the people who belong to it, but the group as a group. If, for instance, you deport those people to different countries where they can no longer sustain their identity as a group, that can be part of an allegation of genocide. That is a very peculiar definition, peculiar convention. It's different from everything else because it speaks about the destruction of a group rather than of individuals. Rather, individuals are destroyed as members of that group. So that's why when you say that something is genocide, it's difficult to prove it because you have to show that there is an intent, that someone has expressed that intent either in words or by the pattern of their operations. And then you have to show that that intent is being implemented. So it's difficult to prove, but once it's proven, this has a particular important international resonance. And one last important thing is that any country or individual who are found guilty of genocide, genocide is not like, say, a war crime where you could say that a particular army unit or a particular general carried out war crimes. Genocide is a social event. A country engaged in genocide, the whole country in one way or another becomes engaged in that. It's not only a particular institution. And so the long-term stain that such a country will then have to bear for generations is completely different from any other. And therefore, you have to be very careful in identifying when it is genocide, also because of the major moral and historical implications of that.
And that country right now carrying out a genocide is Israel against the Palestinians with this war criminal extremist regime of Benjamin Netanyahu, Ben Gvir, and also Smotrich, men who do not use any euphemisms, no dog whistles, are about as unsubtle as anyone can possibly be. And the question that I have for you, Professor Bartov, is you were actually much more careful in labeling Israel's actions genocide. You waited. What was it about Israel's current campaign that made you finally decide, and also finally decide to come out in the New York Times and say, I know genocide. I've studied it. I'm Jewish. I'm Israeli. This is genocide. I, I lost you.
Is that okay?
Perfect. Got you back.
So, so let me say first, they are using euphemisms. And in fact, in all genocides, people use euphemisms because people, organizations, governments, armies don't like to say that they're carrying out genocide. They call it something else. They say they have to do it. They say there's an enemy from within. They say we have no choice. They say all kinds of things. One euphemism that is used often is humanitarian. So, for instance, we have now a Gaza humanitarian foundation, which is supposed to be handing out food, although it's been described as a trap to kill people. There's been talk about creating a humanitarian city over the ruins of Rafah, which would actually be a concentration camp. So euphemisms are very common, and they are also being used in Israel, apart from the very brutal language that is also applied. Now, why did I decide eventually to call this a genocide? I actually came to that conclusion already in May of 2024, and I wrote about it originally in August in a long article in The Guardian. So the one in the New York Times came a year later, almost a year later, and it had to do with everything that has happened since. But the original moment at which I concluded that there was no choice but to speak of genocide was when the IDF moved into Rafah.
Yeah.
And there were then about 1 million people in Rafah. Most of them were people who had been displaced multiple times because the IDF had told them that their homes were about to become areas of operations, and that for their own safety, it would be good for them to move. And once they moved out, those areas were destroyed. And they ended up in Rafah. And then, in order to take over that city, the IDF displaced them once more
Mm.
to Al Mawasi, to the sort of beach area along the southwestern coast of Gaza, which had no humanitarian infrastructure whatsoever. And 1 million people, that's half of the population of Gaza, right? And then the IDF moved in and destroyed Rafah. By August, it was gone. Now, at that point, I asked myself, is the IDF carrying out the official war goals of the Israeli government, which were to destroy Hamas and to release the hostages? And those seemed, on the face of it, reasonable because Hamas did conduct a brutal attack on Israel and killed 800 civilians. And obviously, the government also wanted the hostages back. My conclusion was that that's not what he was doing. And in fact, it has not accomplished either goal to this day. What it was engaged in is realizing what political and military leaders in Israel had said in the immediate aftermath of October 7th, which was, we will destroy Gaza. There will be no water, there will be no food, there will be no power. There are no uninvolved people. We are fighting human animals and they will be treated as such. Those were the statements which indicated that the main goal was to make Gaza uninhabitable for its population. And by May, it became clear that the IDF was engaged in systematically destroying everything in Gaza: schools, hospitals, universities, housing, of course, infrastructure, water plants, museums, archives, everything that stood, so as to make it not only impossible for people to come back to the homes that they were told to leave, but also that everything that is needed for a population to maintain its health, its education, and its collective memory was being erased with the goal of ethnically cleansing the Gaza Strip. But because there was no place for these people to go, Palestinians have no place to go to, they can't leave the Gaza Strip, this ethnic cleansing operation became, as has happened often in the 20th century, into a genocidal operation, which is ongoing.
And Omer Bartov, for those who don't know, you are a Jewish American. You were born in Israel. You served in the IDF. This is deeply personal for you. I don't know whether or not you describe yourself as a Zionist. I'm assuming yes.
Yes.
And a Zionist Jewish American, uh, the Israel that you knew or the Israel that you hoped for versus what the Israel has become. If you could take us back in the DeLorean when you were a young man serving in the IDF, what did you think Israel was at that time and what Israel would become?
So this is actually the topic of the book that you mentioned at the beginning. Um, so Zionism as a movement, which began in the 1880s, long before I was born, was a movement of liberation, of emancipation, of appeal to humanitarianism. It was a movement among European Jews who felt increasingly challenged by anti-Semitism, by ethno-nationalism, and by increasing violence, which culminated in the Holocaust, but there were many previous cases of violence. My question is precisely this question. How did that movement of national liberation and emancipation and human rights become a state ideology that is itself increasingly, over the years, became increasingly ethno-national, expansionist, militaristic, and by now racist. And when I say that I'm a Zionist, I cannot support the kind of Zionism that this country now claims to be its state ideology. That to me is abhorrent. The kind of Zionism that I thought I was born into and I was raised in a Zionist home was a very different kind of idea of what country it would be. But it was changing during the time that I was growing up. When I served in the Israeli army in the 1970s, in 74, 75, I served in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip. I was very young, of course, I was 19, 20, 21, not that intellectually developed. I came to feel that I was an occupier, that
Mm.
I was walking, patrolling the streets of towns, of villages that didn't belong to me, that I was a threat to those people. And I could not quite explain to myself why I was there. I was a soldier. I was doing what I was told to do. But that was the beginning of a thought that something was wrong. And in fact, even before joining the army, in 1970, 71. These are the early years after the War of 67, right? This is after Israel 67 occupies large numbers of Palestinians, many of whom were kicked out in the Nakba of 1948.
Right.
So it sort of wins them over again. But of course, it doesn't give them any rights. During those early years, even before I went to the army, I did belong to a group that was opposed to the occupation. And our slogan, which turns out to be truer than we ever believed, was that occupation corrupts.
Mm.
And what has happened to the country, if you want the sort of final analysis of it, is that the whole society, Israeli society, has been corrupted by years of colonizing another people. In Israel Palestine, in the space between the Jordan and the sea, there are 40 million people. 7 million are Jews and 7 million are Palestinians. And the Jews lord it over the Palestinians. If you occupy people for so long, it brutalizes you and
Yeah.
it brutalizes them. You cannot prevent that. It corrupts the entire system. And what we see now, of course, is the bitterest fruit of those years of occupation and dehumanization.
I appreciate that answer, Professor. I've gone three times to Israel, Palestine. I've gone to the occupied territories. I've gone to the West Bank. I've gone to Jerusalem, gone to Haifa, Tel Aviv, and I wrote an article which was controversial at the time for the Atlantic. And my analysis, my conclusion rather, was that obviously it's asymmetric, unfair, and unbalanced, but the cost, I said the cost to Israel and specifically Israeli society. I also said the words Judaism was that the conquest of the land, the reclaiming of the land. And some settlers, Israeli settlers, they use the word redemption. I said the redemption of the land will come at a massive cost, and that cost will be a spiritual cost, a moral cost, where the land will be elevated and placed above Judaism, Israel, democracy, freedom, and human rights. The land has become the golden calf. And I think I wrote that like 7 or 8 years ago. And here we see it right now. And there's Israeli historian Yuval Harari, and as we're recording this, this has gone viral, where Israeli Zionist Jewish scholar, he said, what is happening right now in Israel could basically, I think, destroy, void 2,000 years of Jewish thinking and culture and existence, end quote. Your response to that?
So, look, first of all, I would say that this process now, while Israel is carrying out genocide in Gaza and escalating ethnic cleansing of the West Bank with a huge amount of violence that is sort of under the radar, the impact of that on Israeli society and Israeli politics is that whatever was left of Israeli democracy and Israeli liberalism is being eroded as we speak. The entire judicial system is collapsing. The police has become a completely different force, a kind of militia under President Ben-Gvir. The consequence of this, if this process is not stopped, is that Israel will become a full-blown apartheid state, authoritarian state, a violent state, not only against occupied Palestinians, and of course, increasingly Palestinians who are Israeli citizens, but also against its own Jewish citizens, anyone who stands up against that regime. And it is also becoming an increasingly halachic state. In
Mm.
many ways, what you find is that the extremists in Israel, who don't represent the majority of the population, but who have the power, people like Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, and Ben-Gvir, traces his roots to Kahana, so
Yep.
who was a Jewish Nazi. I mean, that those people want to create the kind of state that is a mirror image of the kind of state that Hamas had in mind. Rather than an Islamic Palestinian state, this would be a halachic Jewish state, with the other group either entirely vanishing from there or under the boot of the rulers. Now, what does that mean? If Israel becomes that state, and Israel has now slightly over half of the Jewish population of the world, what happens to Judaism?
Mm.
What happens to American Jewry? I believe that other Jewish communities, much as they had over the years grown to love Israel and see it as part of their own identity, will distance themselves from that country because A, it would be embarrassing to be associated with a country that will obviously become a pariah state and will also be increasingly divorced from its own allies because it was supposed to be the villa in the jungle, right? It was
Yeah.
the outpost of democracy and liberalism in the Middle East. Uh, and it would become an apartheid state, but also that state will be a major cause of anti-Semitism around the world because Israel claims to be the representative of Jews around the world. It doesn't ask Jewish communities whether they accept it. It makes that assertion. And for Jews to be associated with a state of that sort will also be an existential danger. And therefore, yes, it will be a splitting, a complete splitting of the diaspora, of Jews living in countries like Britain and France and Germany, and of course in the United States, and the kind of Judaism that is appearing now in Israel, which is more closely related to the zealots of the who fought and died on Masada, those who destroyed the Second Temple, than to anything that we believe Judaism was over the intervening 2,000 years. That, in a sense, that splitting of Judaism and that part of it becomes a racist authoritarian state will, I think it's true, be the greatest tragedy that has happened to the Jews, certainly since the Holocaust. And I want to cite, my father was a Zionist, was born in Palestine, was a writer and a journalist and a true believer. He fought in World War II. He fought in the War of 1948. In his last years, and he died in 2016, he spoke openly about Benjamin Netanyahu as the greatest wrecker of Zionism.
Mm.
Of course, it was the Zionism that he understood to be the true Zionism of equality, of fighting against oppression, of liberation. And Netanyahu is creating more than anyone else. It's not simply that he's, catering to the people to his far right. It is his policy. It is his ideology. And he's creating a monster that will be now identified with what being Jewish is.
Professor, from the Palestinian perspective and from Palestinian scholars, right, they would say that this was inevitable in the sense that when you say Israel, what went wrong, uh, actually, for many Israeli leaders, this is what went right because it was always expansionist. It was always about conquest. It was always about, river to the sea. I'm not talking about all Israelis. I'm talking about some of the leaders and some of the ideologues, right? And they say, look at the Nakba. The creation of the state of Israel as a nation state came at the expense and shattering of the Palestinian people. And then you had 1967. Then you had the settlements and the expansion of the settlements with every government. So this is not necessarily what went wrong, but this is what went right. Like this was the end result of Zionism. Your response to Palestinians who say that, I mean, obviously, and folks, I'm saying it's obviously going wrong for all the reasons that Professor Bertov mentioned, but they would say that this is the end goal of the Netanyahus and the Ben Gurions, right? This is the Begins. Like this is what they always wanted, and now they've achieved it. at such a cost?
Look, I mean, I don't entirely disagree. As a historian, I don't believe in determinism in history, so I don't think that everything was, the writing was all on the wall, that everything was inevitable. I think there were many points at which things could change. I personally remember very well the 1990s, before Rabin was assassinated, that there was a change, and you could feel the change. There was a change in the among the Jewish population of Israel, but there was a change among Palestinians, Palestinian citizens of Israel, and you could feel it also elsewhere. There was a hope. Things could have changed. But yes, there is a logic. That logic would have been different, and that's something that I try to talk about in this book. In 1948, Zionism accomplished what it set out to do. It created the Jewish majority state. Now, it did it not by bringing millions of Jews from Europe, because most of those Jews had been murdered, but by kicking most of the Palestinians out. That's how it created the Jewish majority state. So that state was created on the tragedy of the Palestinians. That is, one cannot argue with that. But it was still faced then with a choice. Would it say, okay, Zionism accomplished its goal, and now I want to create a state, the kind of state that I dreamt of, that would be a state of equality, of dignity for all of which is written into the Declaration of the State of Israel, known in Israel as the Declaration of Independence. It promised that by October that year, there would be a constitution that would reflect the ideals of that declaration. And we're still waiting for that constitution. It was never written. Now, had there been such a constitution, which can still be written, what change would that have made? Could
Mm.
it have made the course of history different? And I think it might have, not entirely, because the Nakba would not have been reversed. But something could have happened. The state could have struck some kind of reconciliation with the Palestinians, could have allowed large numbers back, could have stopped this idea that there has to be separation between Jews and Palestinians, could have promoted the creation of Palestinian independence, could have thought about its own citizens as not only being people who have to be identified as Jews, but as citizens of a state. All of that was written into, in fact, its ideals. But instead, Zionism was twisted into a kind of different ideology of militarism, of expansion, and eventually of racism.
Mm.
And so, is it now inevitable? We don't know, because the way I look at it now, if the course of history continues as it seems to be, because Israel is getting away with this, it will create a country that will not be there for the long haul.
Mm.
Because a country that is oppressive, that is clearly an apartheid state, that is losing its allies, and that is losing the support of Jews around the world, will not be able to exist as such for long. And what will happen then? Well, you can think of such countries. You can think of what happened to South Africa. You can think of a country having to change because it has brought itself into a cul-de-sac, because it is a one-way street and it must change. But of course, that will be at the end of a great deal of bloodshed and oppression and suffering by all, and most of all by Palestinians, of course. Um, so it is a tragic moment. I think when I think of October 7th, I know that people like Netanyahu and Ben Gvir and Smotrich and generally the national religious, once they got over the shock, they thought this is the opportunity we
Yeah.
have. Clearly, they thought that, and they're trying to implement that. But you can think about it also as a very different opportunity, as an opportunity to realize that you cannot persist with violence, that bombs will never solve this issue, that you have to change the political paradigm. And I think there are forces in Israel, among Jewish Israelis and among Palestinians, who want to see that, who want to seek a different path. But they don't have the wherewithal within their own societies to bring it about. They need pressure from the outside. They need, most of all, the United States
Yep.
and of course Europeans to help them Germany can do a great deal because Germany has had the experience of coming from a devastating war and genocide and remaking itself as a different society. They need that help so that those forces that exist in those societies can come out from the oppression and from the bloody mindedness that exists there now. But we have to help them. And we have to believe in that. If we only believe in this kind of logic that all of that had to happen, uh, oppression and destruction and ultimately genocide, then we're playing into the hands of the extremists. And I don't think we should do that.
I want to ask a final question. You teed it up perfectly. Is we're already seeing Israel split itself, and we're already seeing Jews, and I'm talking about the 60 million Jews being split for the first time, I would say, ever in America in my life. The fact that we've seen the Pew poll, Gallup poll, CNN polls showing a majority of young people are pro-Palestinian because they've seen a genocide live stream to their phone. Young Jewish Americans increasingly moving away from Israel. Israel is becoming a pariah state, and use the term South Africa. I told that to people also. It reminds me of the 80s when South Africa, very quickly, due to its apartheid policies, became a pariah state. They literally started becoming the bad guys, the villains in movies. In addition to apartheid, you also have occupation and genocide, and you have anti-Semitic conspiracy theories openly being promoted by the right wing and MAGA, right? So this is terrible for Jews, both in Israel and abroad. Obviously, it's terrible for Palestinians, terrible for Muslims and Arabs because you see the spike in Islamophobia and anti-Arab violence, and also terrible for defenders of Israel. And so you see this like a drunk driver going 120 miles per hour off a cliff, and the United States in particular, which gives Israel funding, weapons, and diplomatic support, instead of being the friend and says, "I'm going to take away the keys," we say, "All right, Israel, here's a new Porsche." And this is where I ask about, you said, bringing back full circle, obligations, right? Why the term genocide matters. The countries that sign on to the Genocide Convention, Europe, United States of America, there's an obligation to step in, to intervene, to stop. What type of intervention would you like to see from the United States of America? And how could the United States of America at this particular time stop Israel from not only committing a genocide, but also destroying itself?
Look, I mean, the tragedy is that unlike the war between Russia and Ukraine, or the illegal invasion of Ukraine by Russia, uh, it's very easy to stop Israel. President Biden could have done it in December of 2023.
Yep.
If the United States said to Israel, if an American president said, you have 2 weeks to wrap this up, and if you don't, you're on your own, that would be it, because Israel cannot militarily operate without massive supplies of munitions from the United States and also from Germany. And it cannot operate without a diplomatic Iron Dome by the United States. If the United States said, well, we have given up on those guys, then whatever the ICJ decides or whatever the General Assembly decides goes to the Security Council. And the Security Council, without an American veto, would immediately impose sanctions and embargo on Israel. This is what happened with South Africa, and Israel would not be able to function. So any rational Israeli government, and even Netanyahu, would see that, would change their policy because they simply can't do it. Now, can we expect Trump to do that? We have no idea what Trump would do. I must say, I've no clue, because he has veered in one direction. There would not have been a ceasefire in January without Trump imposing it, and that allowed for food to come into Gaza, and that allowed for large numbers of hostages to be released. But then when Netanyahu broke the ceasefire unilaterally, he did nothing. And he also all the population out so that you could build a resort in Gaza,
Mm.
which he forgot about, but in Israel. Sorry, there's something with this
No,
mic.
I got you. You got you clear.
Um, and that was, of course, immediately what Trump said about moving the Palestinians out and rebuilding Gaza, which he forgot about in Israel, was immediately endorsed.
Yep.
Now we have license to ethnically cleanse the area and then, of course, not bring resorts, but settlements, which is the goal. So we don't know what Trump will do, but we do know that if the American public, and as you say, public opinion is changing rapidly, not only on the right, but also among Republicans,
Yeah.
and certainly in Jewish communities, certainly among the young. If we can put pressure on this government, and if we can have cooperation between Arab Americans, Muslim Americans, and Jewish Americans together, because they care both about Israel and about Palestinians, and they realize that the only way that you can change this horror that is happening now is not by speaking about removing the other group, not by saying this will be ours or this will be ours. Those people are illegitimate or those people are illegitimate. The people who live there will live there. You cannot reverse history, but you have to create a different way for them to live, a different way for them to share. If that comes from the United States, that will begin a change also in the region. It will have an impact, of course, on European countries. And that could be a shift in a completely different and much more hopeful direction than what these extremists, I must say, on both sides would like to see.
I can only say inshallah, Professor Bartov. I hope for the best
Inshallah.
because, like you said, no one's going back either here or there. Our futures are intertwined, our destinies are shared, and we need responsible, ethical, moral leaders to step up and provide political solutions to this political problem. We all know what needs to be done. We just need the pressure being installed by friends who, instead of giving a drunk driver a new Porsche and a new car each time they, bulldoze through a neighborhood, steps in and says enough. And I think this will hopefully can reverse the course. And like you said, we can't change the past, but we can change the future, folks. So we need everyone to who cares about the future, cares about humanity, to speak up, use your voice. There's a genocide happening in real time in our lifetime. And I think history will judge us, what we said and what we didn't say, whether we enabled it and were complicit or we stood up against it. So I appreciate you, Professor Bartov. You have a very strong voice, important voice, and the fact that you use that voice to come out on the side of justice. And I look forward to your book, Israel, What Went Wrong. It's coming out in April. I hope you can join me again. Folks, this has been the Left Hook with Wajahat. There's no paywalls. Everything is free. If you have a few dollars, hey, give it to me. If not, it's fine. Give it to a Palestinian Relief Fund. But be informed, be kind, be empathetic. My guest was historian Professor Omer Bartov. I will link to his article and his bio and his book, which inshallah will be come out in April, and he'll join us again. Until next time, be kind, be empathetic, and please, oh please, don't be a fascist.